Horrible news in the city of Atlanta as a mother strangles her son to death for being gay.
November 15th, 2017, dawned like any other autumn day in Atlanta. The Georgia sun cast long shadows across the city's downtown skyline as students hurried to school, parents rushed to work, and life moved at its usual hectic pace. For 14-year-old Giovanni Melton, this ordinary Wednesday would be his last day alive. The red brick apartment complex on Westview Drive, where Giovanni lived with his mother, Wendell Melton, looked like countless others scattered throughout Atlanta's working-class neighborhoods. Unit 247 had been their home for the past 3 years, a modest 2-bedroom apartment where the kitchen paint was peeling and the air conditioning worked only when it wanted to. But for Giovanni, it was home. At least it had been, until everything changed. That morning, Giovanni stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his navy blue school uniform shirt. His dark brown eyes stared back at him, filled with a mixture of determination and fear. At 14, he was tall for his age, with a lean build and a smile that could light up a room, when he allowed himself to smile these days. Lately, those smiles had become increasingly rare. "Giovanni, you're going to be late," his mother's voice carried through the thin walls, making him flinch slightly. There was an edge to her tone that had become all too familiar over the past few months. "Coming, Mom," he called back, quickly grabbing his backpack. Inside, carefully hidden in a side pocket, was a small rainbow pin his best friend Sophia had given him last week. It was his secret treasure, a tiny symbol of who he really was. Westview High School was a typical Atlanta public school, its halls filled with the usual chaos of teenage life. For Giovanni, it had become a sanctuary of sorts. Here, he could be himself, at least a little bit more than at home. His teachers knew him as a bright student with a particular talent for science. His dream of becoming a doctor didn't seem far-fetched to anyone who saw his grades. During lunch period that day, Giovanni sat with Sophia Washington in their usual spot near the cafeteria windows. The November sun streamed in, warming their table as they picked at their food. "I'm going to tell her today," Giovanni said quietly, pushing his mashed potatoes around his plate. Sophia looked up sharply, her braids swinging with the movement. "Tell your mom? About?" "Yeah." Giovanni's voice was barely above a whisper. "About being gay." Sophia put down her fork, her face etched with concern. "Gee, are you sure? Remember what happened when Marcus came out to his parents? And your mom, she's not exactly understanding?" Giovanni finished with a bitter laugh. "I know. But Sophia, I can't keep living like this. The hiding, the pretending, the constant fear of her finding out some other way. It's killing me inside." What Giovanni didn't know was that his mother had already begun piecing things together. Wendell Melton, a 42-year-old single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep their heads above water, had been watching her son change over the past year with growing alarm. The way he dressed when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked past his room. The distance growing between them like a chasm she couldn't bridge. Wendell had grown up in a strict religious household in rural Georgia, where the lines between right and wrong were drawn with permanent marker and never questioned. She'd carried those beliefs with her into adulthood, holding them close like a shield against a world that often seemed to be losing its moral compass. Her son's emerging identity threatened everything she believed in. That afternoon, as Giovanni walked home from school, each step felt heavier than the last. The Atlanta traffic hummed in the background and fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet. He'd rehearsed the conversation 1,000 times in his head, but none of those mental preparations would prove adequate for what was about to unfold. He found his mother already home when he arrived, sitting at their small kitchen table, still wearing her waitress uniform from her day job. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across her face, making her expression unreadable. "Mom," Giovanni started, his voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" Wendell looked up from her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing slightly. "About what?" "About me, about who I am." Giovanni's hands were shaking, but he forced himself to continue. "Mom, I'm gay. I've known for a while now, and I needed you to know too." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Then, like a dam breaking, everything exploded at once. What happened next would be pieced together through police reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence. Wendell's reaction was immediate and violent, a response born from years of deeply ingrained prejudice and misunderstanding. "No son of mine," she began, her voice rising with each word, "will live in my house and defy God like this." The neighbors in Unit 246 would later tell police they heard shouting around 6:15 p.m. It started as raised voices, then escalated to sounds of items being thrown and furniture being knocked over. "Mom, please." Giovanni's pleas echoed through the apartment. "Just listen to me." But Wendell wasn't listening anymore. In her mind, this wasn't just about her son's sexuality. This was about everything she'd sacrificed, every dream she'd had for him, every prayer she'd whispered over his bed when he was small. In her distorted perspective, Giovanni had not just rejected her values. He'd rejected everything she was. The physical confrontation began in the kitchen. According to the later reconstruction by crime scene investigators, Wendell grabbed Giovanni by his school uniform shirt, pushing him against the refrigerator. Magnets and papers scattered across the linoleum floor. Homework assignments, grocery lists, a perfect math test Giovanni had brought home just last week. "I can fix this," Wendell shouted, her hands moving from his shirt to his throat. "I can save you from this." Giovanni struggled, his hands trying to break his mother's grip. At 14, he was already taller than her, but years of working double shifts had given Wendell a strength that surprised them both. As her fingers tightened around his throat, Giovanni's eyes widened with the terrible realization that his mother wasn't going to stop. Mrs. Jenkins from Unit 245 would later testify that she heard a loud thump around 6:30 p.m., followed by an eerie silence. Like many others in the complex, she had grown accustomed to the arguments from the Melton apartment. This time felt different, but not different enough to call 911. It was a decision that would haunt her for years to come. By 6:45 p.m., Giovanni Melton lay motionless on the kitchen floor. The rainbow pin he'd carried in his backpack had fallen out during the struggle, landing near his outstretched hand like a final statement of who he really was. Wendell stood over her son's body, her waitress uniform now wrinkled and askew, her hands shaking as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking time in a world that had irreversibly changed. She didn't call for help. Instead, she went to Giovanni's room and began methodically going through his things, as if searching for signs she might have missed. She found his journal, hidden between his mattress and box spring, filled with entries about his struggles, his hopes, his fear of her reaction. She found the small rainbow flag he'd kept folded in his sock drawer. She found printed pamphlets from his school's Gay-Straight Alliance, tucked inside his science textbook. Each discovery seemed to harden something inside her. By midnight, she had packed a small bag and taken Giovanni's phone. She left the apartment without looking back at her son's body, locking the door behind her as if she were just leaving for work. The next morning, Giovanni's absence from school raised the first alarms. Sophia Washington knew something was wrong when her best friend didn't respond to any of her texts. Giovanni had promised to let her know how the conversation with his mother went, and he never broke promises. By 9 a.m., the school's automated system had called the Melton apartment to report Giovanni's absence. When no one answered, they called his emergency contact, his Aunt Patricia on his father's side. Patricia, knowing the tension between Giovanni and his mother, immediately felt something was wrong. "I just had a bad feeling," she would later tell reporters. Giovanni was a good kid. He never missed school. And with everything going on, she called the Atlanta Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officers Marcus Rodriguez and Sarah Chen arrived at Unit 247 at 10:15 a.m. They knocked several times, announced their presence, and finally made the decision to force entry when they saw Giovanni's backpack through the window, but got no response. The scene they found would stay with both officers for the rest of their careers. Giovanni lay where he had fallen the night before, his school uniform still neat, except for the creases where his mother had grabbed him. The kitchen told the story of his final moments. overturned chairs, scattered papers, and the small rainbow pin that had fallen from his backpack. The investigation moved swiftly after the discovery of Giovanni's body. Detective Marcus Thompson, a veteran of Atlanta's homicide unit for 15 years, took the lead on the case. As he stood in the Meltons' kitchen that morning, he noticed something that spoke volumes about the victim. A calendar on the refrigerator marked with perfect attendance certificates and upcoming science club meetings. He was just a kid trying to live his life, Thompson would later say during the trial. A kid with dreams, with plans. A kid who should have been safe in his own home. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Chen, determined the cause of death as manual strangulation. The bruising pattern on Giovanni's neck told the story of a prolonged struggle. Defensive wounds on his hands showed he had tried to fight back, to survive. The victim would have lost consciousness after approximately 2 to 3 minutes of sustained pressure, Dr. Chen testified. Death would have occurred within 4 to 5 minutes. He was conscious and aware for most of the struggle. Meanwhile, Wendell Melton had boarded a Greyhound bus headed south. She'd used cash to purchase her ticket, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She kept Giovanni's phone. Although turned off, the device's last ping had registered at the Atlanta bus terminal. Security footage showed her boarding a bus to Savannah at 5:30 a.m., still wearing her waitress uniform. She sat in the back, clutching her small bag, Giovanni's phone, and a well-worn Bible. Fellow passengers would later describe her as eerily calm during the journey, occasionally muttering prayers under her breath. The Atlanta police, working with Georgia State Patrol, tracked the bus's route. 3 days after Giovanni's death, as Wendell attempted to board another bus headed for Florida at the Savannah station, law enforcement moved in. Wendell Melton, Officer James Carter announced, "You're under arrest for the murder of Giovanni Melton." She didn't resist. As they handcuffed her, she simply said, "I did what I had to do. God will understand." Back in Atlanta, the community was reeling from the news. Westview High School, where Giovanni had been a sophomore, became ground zero for grief and outrage. Students who had sat next to him in class, shared lunch tables, or simply passed him in the hallways struggled to comprehend the tragedy. Sophia Washington, devastated by the loss of her best friend, spoke at a candlelight vigil held in the school courtyard. Her voice shaking but determined, she shared the Giovanni she knew. He wanted to be a doctor, she told the crowd of hundreds. He wanted to help people. He was scared to tell his mom the truth, but he was tired of hiding. He told me, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than loved for who I'm not." And now he's gone, because someone who should have loved him unconditionally couldn't accept him for who he was. The case caught national attention, highlighting the ongoing struggles of LGBTQ+ youth in conservative households. News vans lined Westview Drive for weeks. Reporters sought interviews with neighbors, teachers, and friends, all trying to understand how a mother could kill her child for being gay. Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, the neighbor who had heard the final argument, broke down during a television interview. "I should have called someone. I heard him screaming, but I did nothing. How many other kids are screaming right now, and we're all just turning up our TVs?" The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. The district attorney's office, under pressure from both the community and national civil rights organizations, pursued the case as a hate crime in addition to first-degree murder charges. The trial began 6 months after Giovanni's death. The courthouse became a symbol of the divide in the community. On one side, supporters of Wendell gathered with signs quoting Bible verses. On the other hand, LGBTQ activists and supporters held rainbow flags and pictures of Giovanni. Inside the courtroom, prosecutor Rachel Martinez built a methodical case. She presented Giovanni's journal entries, text messages to friends expressing his fears, and testimony from teachers who had noticed his increasing anxiety in the months before his death. The trial of Wendell Melton lasted 3 weeks, revealing layer upon layer of a family tragedy that had been years in the making. The prosecution painted a picture of escalating tension, psychological abuse, and finally, murderous intolerance. Giovanni's science teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, provided some of the most compelling testimony. 2 weeks before his death, Giovanni stayed after class to ask me about college requirements for pre-med programs. he testified, his voice thick with emotion. He was already planning his future. He told me he wanted to specialize in adolescent psychiatry to help other kids who were struggling with their identity. The defense attempted to portray Wendell as a devoted single mother who had temporarily lost control in a moment of religious crisis. Her attorney, James Morton, argued for a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, claiming the revelation of Giovanni's sexuality had triggered a heat of passion response. But the evidence told a different story. The prosecution presented Giovanni's laptop, which contained searches from months earlier about LGBTQ+ youth shelters and emancipation laws. They showed text messages to Sophia discussing his mother's increasing hostility, even before he officially came out. One message, sent just a week before his death, read, "Sometimes I see her watching me, and there's this look in her eyes, like she knows and she hates me for it. I'm scared, Sophia, but I can't pretend anymore." The most damaging evidence came from Wendell herself. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Martinez asked her about the moments after Giovanni's death. "You didn't call 911, Martinez stated. "You didn't try to revive him. Instead, you went through his room, gathering evidence of his sexuality. Why?" Wendell's response sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "I needed to understand where I had failed as a mother, where the devil had found his way in." The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder with a hate crime enhancement. Judge Sarah Thompson sentenced Wendell Melton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her sentencing statement, Judge Thompson addressed Wendell directly. "You didn't fail as a mother when your son told you he was gay. You failed as a mother when you chose your prejudice over your child's life." The aftermath of Giovanni's death and his mother's conviction rippled through Atlanta and beyond. The state legislature began working on Giovanni's law, aimed at increasing penalties for crimes motivated by prejudice against sexual orientation or gender identity. Westview High School established the Giovanni Melton Memorial Scholarship, awarded annually to LGBTQ+ students pursuing careers in medicine or mental health services. The first recipient was Sophia Washington, who would go on to become a child psychologist specializing in LGBTQ+ youth trauma. The apartment complex where Giovanni died was transformed into a community center for LGBTQ+ youth, named Giovanni's Place. The kitchen where he spent his final moments became a safe space where teens could find acceptance, support, and most importantly, protection. 5 years after Giovanni's death, his story continues to serve as both a warning and a call to action. Support groups for parents of LGBTQ+ children use his case to illustrate the devastating consequences of rejection. Schools across the country have strengthened their anti-bullying policies and increased resources for LGBTQ+ students. In her last public statement before beginning her life sentence, Wendell Melton spoke to reporters. "I thought I was saving my son's soul. Instead, I committed an unforgivable sin. To any parent out there struggling with their child's identity, choose love. I chose wrong, and I lost everything." Giovanni's Aunt Patricia now runs a support group for families of LGBTQ+ youth. She keeps a photo of Giovanni on her desk, him at 13, smiling broadly at his 8th grade graduation. "He never got to become the doctor he dreamed of being," she says, "but he's still saving lives. Every time his story prevents another parent from rejecting their child, every time it helps another teen find the courage to live authentically, Giovanni's spirit lives on." The story of Giovanni Melton ended tragically, but its impact continues to reshape conversations about acceptance, love, and the fundamental right of every child to be who they are without fear. His brief life and devastating death became a catalyst for change, a reminder that the cost of intolerance can be measured in human lives.